So while the feeling of happiness is the same in contemporary society as it was thousands of years ago traditionally, the pursuit of happiness, the path to happiness has changed. Hello, happy campers. Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Contemporary Happiness Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the art and science of happiness in contemporary society. I'm your host, David Nima. I'm a lawyer by trade and your happiness coach. In today's episode, we are going to talk about what is contemporary happiness. Contemporary happiness naturally contrasts with traditional happiness. And the general premise of this podcast and this entire philosophy of contemporary happiness is that the same things that made people happy hundreds of years ago may not be applicable in contemporary society. They may either not make you happy in contemporary times, or they may not be the only way for you to be happy in contemporary times. Now, at its core, the question is, what is happiness first, right? And as I've discussed in the past, happiness is the absence of stress. And a person that feels happy today is feeling happy just like a person felt happy 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Happiness is subjective. And just like today, different things will make different people happy. Different things that made people happy thousands of years ago may be different than the things that make people happy today. So while the feeling of happiness is the same in contemporary society as it was thousands of years ago traditionally, the pursuit of happiness, the path to happiness has changed. Let's talk about a couple of examples where something that was done traditionally to create happiness may not apply in contemporary society. For example, let's talk about food and hunting. In traditional times, a man was well advised to get married so that his wife can cook food for him. Without getting married, by not getting married, he would literally risk starvation because he didn't know how to cook for himself. And this kind of applies even today. Right now, there's some men that just can't cook for themselves and they resort to fast food and unhealthy eating habits. But that's for another topic. But the point is that traditionally, a man would get married so that he has someone to cook and clean the house. Okay? Also, a woman would be well advised to get married to a man so that the man can go out and hunt for food. Okay? Maybe even in more modern times, the man would go and work and gain and make money for food because the woman was unable to work. In some societies, for whatever reason, either women don't work or they're not legally permitted to work. And you can imagine 200 years ago, as a woman, you'd be well advised to marry a man so that he can provide food, which you would then cook. Right? And whether that's through traditional hunting or through going to work and earning money so you can buy food. Well, in contemporary society, a man doesn't need a woman to cook. A man can learn how to cook by watching YouTube videos. A man can order out to eat. Men are not going to literally starve if they're not married because they can source their own food, their own fresh food or hot food without the need of having a woman in the house. Also, in contemporary times, a woman doesn't need a man to go and hunt for food. Not only can she work in contemporary society and earn her own money to go buy food, or she can buy food from the grocery store. She doesn't need to go and hunt personally and, kill a deer, for example, so that she can eat food that night. So that's one example in food and hunting, for example, and essentially food and eating and having a full stomach, that both men and women, while traditionally they needed each other because of various societal structures and whatnot, and it was a best practice to associate yourself with someone from the opposite sex to get certain needs met, right? In terms of food and eating and hunting and earning money, which in contemporary times, it's not applicable because now men can, provide their own food and make their own food, and women can make their own money and essentially get their own food as well. So that's one example. Here's another example that illustrates contemporary happiness versus traditional happiness. Security, okay? Traditionally, women walking down the street faced substantial risk of violence from other men on the street. And in traditional times, a woman was well advised to get married to a man and be associated with a man so that when she does go out in public, she is safer. Okay? This is just a classic, condition of, the female experience over the last thousands of years. They were highly, vulnerable to acts of violence, just your run-of-the-mill violence walking down the street. But in contemporary times, women are safer than they've ever been before. A woman walking down the street in London in 2024 is much safer than she was in 1924 or 1824 or 1024. Imagine 1,200 years ago or 1,000 years ago. For a woman to be walking down the street in London versus today. There's security cameras, there's police, people are just much more civilized, and women are a lot safer and no longer have the same risk that was used as a premise to get married 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and essentially in traditional times. So that's another example, security, where the modality or the path to happiness, the pursuit of happiness, has changed in contemporary society. You no longer need to fulfill your security needs by getting married, for example. Another example that illustrates, traditional happiness versus contemporary happiness is elderly care. Now, clearly, you would be happier, everyone's happier if they have someone to care for them during their old age. And everyone wants to be cared for when they're no longer able to care for themselves. And having children is sometimes one of the reasons to have children is that someone can care for you when you get older. That's a very popular reason why people have children. Now, this applied hundreds of years ago where, you lived in a family and, once you were getting older, your children would naturally care for you. But in contemporary times, there is nursing homes, right? We have nursing homes. We have a lot of elderly care services that are available. So you don't necessarily need to have children to be cared for in your elderly years. You don't necessarily. Now, if you can fulfill that need with your children, and that's a whole nother discussion of whether you should or not. But you don't necessarily need to do it. You did necessarily have to have children to be cared for in your elderly years, thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago. But now this whole industry of elderly care is available in contemporary society in a lot of modern societies and countries. So, elderly care is another example where to get that need fulfilled, you don't have to follow the traditional method, right? The traditional best practice, right? To have children. Let's talk about judgment. Okay. So judgment is another act that was beneficial in traditional times. When you judged people, let's say somebody was a known thief, for example, in the village, and if everyone would judge them, right? And this had a benefit because that would not only deter the thief from doing it again, but also kind of put people on notice and warn people that this person is a thief. But in contemporary society, you don't need to judge people to prevent crime, basically, which was the rationale for judging people in traditional society, right? Thou shalt not kill. God says it's bad. You're going to go to hell, for example, if you commit sin, for example. And the whole justification from that, beyond that, is so that to prevent these bad acts, these undesirable actions and conduct, right? Like coveting thy neighbor's wife. You want to stop that from happening. You want to deter society from doing those things. So, judgment and judging others, according to the Ten Commandments, for example, had a utility in traditional times. But in modern societies, we have the judicial system, right? We have police officers that help prevent crime or stop crime. We have the justice system that's designed to punish people for committing crimes and otherwise violating, quote unquote, the social contract. So, you don't need to personally judge somebody, for any kind of conduct that they do. You can just draw your own boundaries based on your personal preferences, but you don't need to go around and judging other people, in terms of who's good or bad. We have a whole system that we pay for with our tax dollars that's designed for that. And I think no judgment is another type of mindset shift in contemporary society that has tremendous value, which wasn't applicable maybe in traditional times. In traditional times, people, judging others, again, like I said, there had some more utility to it. But now, no judgment is, I think, the best path to happiness in contemporary society. Let's talk about what else do we have. Another distinction, evolution in modernity that has, I think, changed a traditional best practice is listening to your parents, and as well as gospel. In traditional times, access to knowledge was very limited, and you got 90% of your wisdom, so to speak, from your parents and from gospel, essentially. But in contemporary society, we have the internet, right? We have access to a tremendous wealth of knowledge that our ancestors didn't in traditional times. And while I think it's still important to take in the wisdom of your parents and take in some wisdom from gospel or from any other sources, you're well advised to think critically about, any kind of advice that you get, and to kind of do your own research and make your own decisions. And you'll probably make your own decision at that time in terms of following certain orders or best practices or things that you're taught by your family and by your religion. You no longer have to just blindly follow your family traditions, and you can, think critically about them and adopt your own traditions based on the wealth of knowledge that's available to you in contemporary times that were never available to your ancestors. So, as you can see, that is the gist of contemporary happiness, is to kind of filter traditional best practices through a lens of the modern lens, so to speak, and to think more critically about a lot of these traditional antiquated modalities to happiness, some of which again may not apply in contemporary society, or are not the only way to reach happiness in contemporary society, given the advancements in technology and culture that we're all experiencing right now. Those are my thoughts on contemporary happiness. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if you can find any other examples between traditional happiness and contemporary happiness. I'm David Nima, and I'll see you all in the next video.